Ça va? Okay. Todo bien? Ni hao? Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Thank you, French Morning. Thank you, Emmanuel Saint-Martin, for organizing such a great bilingual fair each year. It is actually quite fitting to be doing this on this weekend before the marathon and before the election. Being bilingual is more than just learning languages, really. Being bilingual should be the new norm. It's something that every child should have access to, and I think it's a gift that keeps on giving when a child is bilingual. It's not just during childhood, but it's also throughout our life. And this is why it is very important to hear and welcome Professor Ines Ansaldo, who is going to show us the impact of this bilingualism on not just on our brain, but also on our lives and the longevity of our lives. So please help me welcome Professor Ines Ansaldo.
Thank you.
So
Thank you.
we're going to have a very informal conversation, and then we'll take questions later. But Ines, could you please introduce yourself and tell us where you come from, but also what is your connection with this topic of bilingualism?
Yes. First of all, thank you for inviting me today. It's a pleasure to be here. So I am a professor at University of Montreal and a researcher at University of Montreal working on neuroplasticity and brain trajectory and with different factors that can impact the brain throughout life, including bilingualism. And my connection with the topic, I thought a lot about this, and in fact I think there was a connection since I was a little girl in Argentina. Argentina is mostly a unilingual country, I would say, but 85% of the people are descendants of immigrants, so we all have some grandfather or mother or great-grandfather or mother that comes from elsewhere. And this is something that was very much appreciated, and everybody tried to learn a little bit about the culture and the language that our ancestors spoke when they arrived in Argentina. In my case, my family comes from northern Italy and from the Basque country. So I was interested in this, I was curious about this. And I had the chance to have a bilingual education. I learned English since I was a little girl, and I was playing in English and Spanish. I was playing that I was the teacher and I was giving the instructions in English. I remember when I came from school, I spent a lot of time playing like this. And then later in life, when I decided to go into university, I was interested in communication sciences, so I went to the speech pathology program. And from then on, my interest in languages and communication only grew. I got involved in working with people that had aphasia, so language disruption due to brain damage. And at a certain point, I met a gentleman who had bilingual aphasia. So this gentleman was an Argentinian who had come to study to Berkeley. He was very fluent in English, and he had this stroke. And he came to my clinic. At that point, I was only doing clinical work. And I was fascinated to see how he was mixing the two languages, and he couldn't control that. So at that point, I developed a therapy that was in fact aimed at considering him bilingual and not trying to rehabilitate him in one language and not the other, because to me it was evident that bilingual is more than two unilinguals in one brain. It's bilingual. So I developed a procedure that then was published and so forth, in which you use the two languages to rehabilitate the person, and this gives improvement in the two languages in the end, and mostly in communication because it prevents communication breakdown. So all of these influence my life trajectory, I would say, and when I decided to go into a PhD at University of Montreal, I said, okay, I'll do it in French. I had studied some French at secondary school, and I wanted to learn French, really. I could have gone to McGill University and do it in English, but said, no, let's use this opportunity to learn another language. So I went to University of Montreal, and that was something, because I was feeling every day the challenges of being educated in a third language, in that case, and at PhD level is not trivial, so it was effort. But I was feeling this kind of transformation in my mind and in my behavior that was going beyond the number of words that I was learning. And then when I went into a postdoc at McGill University, I said, okay, I have to look at this. I have to look at this from the brain perspective as well, not only from the behavior perspective, but also from the brain perspective. And that is how I've been working on this now for, let's say, 15 years or so, looking at both behavior and brain correlates of bilingualism, mostly in adults and elderly, but of course I have been interested also in kids. And being now a grandmother myself and having 3 grandkids who speak French, English, Spanish, and Persian, I am of course very much interested in this topic.
So it's really a personal story that then you turn into a research project, and now you're the expert on the bilingual brain. I don't know if we can summarize it like this, but could you tell us what is the bilingual brain and what happens in the brain of a bilingual?
Well, in fact, first of all, if you look at what happens when we speak more than one language, there's something that happens in our behavior, and this behavior has an impact on our brain, because our brain is a very, let's say, plastic organ. And everything that we do in life and our life trajectory and experiences have some impact on our brain. Bilingualism is one factor of the many that have impact on the brain. When we speak more than one language, for example, at this point I'm speaking English, but I have my mother tongue that is Spanish, my French that has become very strong, because now I have been in Montreal for 25 years and I'm living in French, teaching French, and so these 3 languages that are there, popping up all the time, and I have to focus on English now, but the other languages are activated there, and they are trying to intrude themselves in what I say. You can listen to my accent, have a mixture of accents, and I have to control this somehow, and the way I do so is putting into play my executive function. Executive function is a very important ability, cognitive ability that we use in everyday life. Executive function involves attention, focus of attention, inhibiting information that is not relevant at a certain point. So when we are bilingual, we are drilling our executive function all the time. And this is something very important, because this drill has an impact on our behavior and on our brain. At the behavioral level, what happens is that bilinguals of all ages, and since very young, learn how to filter out information that is not relevant for the present situation. And to do so, they also learn to grasp the most important cues of the environment. This is simply marvelous, not only when you are a kid, because you understand situations faster, but also when you're a grown-up. And it is part of what we call social skills and communication skills, which are more and more appreciated and looked for when you get to positions that are very important in life, because communication is the key of anything that we do.
Is it true that, can we say that being bilingual brings you superpowers? You read articles every week or so in the news that says bilinguals are better in math, they're better in music, they're better at this and that. Is this true?
I don't like the super thing, because it's not super, it's that the brain has this potential, and bilingualism, like other things that we can learn in life, for example music, somehow allows the brain to explain these powers. It is true that kids that are bilingual, in general, they are better in maths and better in communication skills in general, and this is because of what I said, because they can go straight to the point. They don't get distracted with environmental cues. And of course, attention and focus of attention is an ability that is very important in learning in general. So this is not surprising. It's just that we hadn't looked at it before. And now we're looking at it systematically, and we're also looking at what happens in the brain, because there's also the brain correlates with this. And this correlates are very interesting, because when we look at what happens when you learn a new language, even if you have learned it for, let's say, some months, if you do that in an intensive manner, there's changes in your gray matter. And the gray matter is very important in your brain, and there are specific areas in the brain that are important in decoding complex information and in analyzing information that get thicker because of the learning. There's a study, I remember now, one of the studies that was done in Germany by a German group, showing that people that came to a German airline and had to learn German and were trained in a very intensive manner, some colleagues in Germany had the good idea of measuring the gray matter before and after the training, and they found that there was increase in gray matter. But you can say, okay, there's increase in gray matter, but how does this affect behavior? Does it change anything in behavior? And in fact, when you look at what happens with aging, then you realize that it has an impact, because when we age, something that happens is that we lose gray matter. So if we have some kind of reserve, some kind of gray matter reserve, what we think now, we are doing a lot of research on aging and bilingualism, and what has been shown by a colleague and friend in India, Suvarna Aladi, is that even if the people get an illness like, let's say, Alzheimer's disease, the expression of the symptoms of the illness arrives around 5 or 6 years later in a bilingual, because they can go and take advantage of the reserve, of the neural reserve. You will say, okay, 5, 6 years, it's not a big deal, but in fact it is a big deal, because it changes the quality of life of the person a lot. So that is to say that the impacts of bilingualism are across lifespan, and also white matter. You know, white matter also, it's very important in the brain. It's like the highways where information circulates, and we also lose white matter when we age, and bilinguals have better preserved white matter as well.
So now I'm curious, who is a bilingual then? Are we all bilinguals in this room, or what do you have to do to benefit from all of these advantages?
Well, that's an excellent question, because we have studied this from many points of view. We first said, okay, it's only when you learn a language when you are very young that you really become a bilingual. And there was this age of acquisition kind of perspective of the bilingual advantage. Then we realized that although this is true, it is not the whole truth, because even when you learn a language later in life, you can also benefit from these advantages if you use the language frequently. In other words, what we know today is that it is not only a matter of learning the language, it is that you have to use it. And the more you use it in a naturalistic context, the better it is, because it's much easier to speak language when you are in the classroom and everybody is speaking the same language and all the instructions are giving in the target language. Then when you are outside there and you get involved in situations where you have speakers of different languages and you have to code switch between the languages, at that point is when you really drill your executive function and when you really put your brain into the challenge that with practice and with, let's say, continuing challenge will bring you the advantages.
So you think that makes your brain stronger?
Yes.
And that is even something that everyone should be doing to get
I think so.
to become healthier and live longer.
I think so. You know, I come from Canada, and in Canada we are a bilingual country, but now we are much more than a bilingual country, but let's say officially a bilingual country. And even at the level of policy, this is becoming an issue, educational policy, because if we really show all of these advantages and we can prove them, we are trying to prove them in large cohorts, because there's been lots of, some studies were not correctly done, and there's been lots of let's say, confusion in the literature. So we really need to be very strict in terms of research methodology, and we really need to prove this in a very strong manner. But more and more people are spontaneously going into the bilingual education perspective. And in fact, if you look at the world map today, more than half of the world population is already bilingual. I mean, it's just a fact. And on top of that, we see that there are some advantages to it, which are not only, I would say, not only cognitive and neural advantages. I think that there's many other advantages of knowing a second language or a third language that have to do with getting into the culture that comes with the language. In Quebec, we know this very well, and the province of Quebec is a Francophone-speaking province in Canada, and we are very proud of this French heritage. And when you learn a language, you also learn, let's say, the sense of humor of this language, which has to do with the cultural values of the language. You learn the implicits of the language. And in doing so, you can understand better the people. And if you understand better the people, you are less afraid. And if you are less afraid, there's lots of bad things that are controlled. So I think it's something that goes, that has many advantages at many different levels.
So you think that monolingualism can be cured? I'm not very, I don't want this kind of extreme things, because I think that everything is in the nuance. But I think that if people are exposed to different languages, I know very few people that would resist if this is done with a correct attitude. It's a matter of attitude also. But I think that more and more, again, if you look at the new generations, I mean, it's just amazing. I've been in Montreal for 25 years now. And when I arrived, people were speaking mostly English and French, and some Spanish, and maybe Portuguese, a little bit of Arabic languages, but not that much at that point. Today, it's just crazy. I mean, and people, it's no longer an issue. Oh, we have to speak only our mother tongue. No, it's no longer an issue. I mean, you speak to people, to the young. Okay, I'm a professor at the university, so I'm in contact with young people, but this is highly educated people also.
but people don't care. But we can speak all the languages we are exposed to. I mean, the better, the more the merrier. So I think that it's becoming something that people really are fond of, especially in the new generations. But also all the intercultural couples that bring a lot to this, because I remember when I arrived in Montreal, I was fascinated coming from Buenos Aires, which is quite monolithical, walking along the streets and looking at mixed couples and looking at the poussette to see what does it give, you know, because it's all of this mélange is contributing to the fact that bilingualism is becoming more the rule than the exception.
It is touching my heart, because this is what we keep repeating here in New York, and all the schools that are here in this room, and all the educators and parents in this room are definitely agreeing with this, right? Yeah. Okay. So there's something I need to ask you about the technical stuff, because I don't know what it looks like to work on the brain and study the brain and measure the brain, but could you guide us through, in a nutshell, of course, those heavy equipments that you use?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So, okay, what we do is that we look at the brains with a big machine that is called functional MRI. Functional MRI is a very powerful machine, that I can say powerful, in the sense that it shows changes in brain activation, namely the different brain areas that get involved when you are performing a specific task. So what we do is that we put people in the scanner, in the fMRI scanner, which is a big tube, and the person is lying down there, and we make the person do some kind of tasks that are set to tap on specific cognitive functions that we want to measure. And we take images of the brain performing the activity. This is by means of complex, let's say, analysis that I won't explain, but in the end, it gives you an image where you can see what parts of the brain are involved and to what extent they are involved in the performance of a specific task, and you can compare different populations, let's say bilinguals and monolinguals that are doing the same task, and see which part of the brains get activated in either group. And more than that now, I'm working not only with brain physicists, but also with computer scientists. We are developing models, mathematical models that reproduce brain networks, because the brain doesn't work little areas getting activated in isolation. The brain works in networks, so these areas speak to each other and they share information. So you can describe networks that are involved, and you can look at how strongly these networks are connected. The connection between the areas, is it strong or is it just a light connection? And by looking at all of these parameters, you can see, for example, whether specific activity recruits one circuit or the other in different populations, and whether, for example, the same task requires a lot of brain in one population and much less brain in another population. And this is more or less the kind of work that we're doing, and we are studying bilinguals and monolinguals to look at these effects of bilingualism on the way the brain performs the tasks.
So am I looking at the front lobes, back lobes? What's working when I speak English or when you speak French and Spanish at the same time?
In fact, it depends on many things. But let's put it this way: if you are a very proficient bilingual, then you recruit the same areas for your second language that for your mother tongue, if you're really a very proficient bilingual. There's no great
Which
difference.
area is this?
Well, I mean, the language areas which are in the temporal lobes and in the frontal Broca's area and so forth.
Do you want to show on my pen?
You want me to point to them?
Sure.
Well, it's somewhere here and here.
Okay.
I'm being very broad now. This is in terms of millimeters, but and less. So, but for example, when you are in a situation where you are, let's say, in a conversation, you are in a cocktail, let's say, and people are speaking several languages, and you're jumping from one language to the other depending on your communication partner, then your frontal lobes are working more because you have to switch from one language to the other. And this is interesting because when we studied bilinguals and monolinguals in the scanner with an executive function task, which is called the Simon task. It's a task in which you have to concentrate on the color of the target without taking care of where on the screen the target appears. It's a square. And every time you see a blue square, you have to press on the right side button, but the blue square can appear on the right side or on the left side, or you have to control for this. And what we see is that if you compare elderly bilinguals and monolinguals on this task, bilinguals simply don't need to recruit the frontal lobes because they are so much drilled in filtering out irrelevant information that they just focus on the color, and you see activations in posterior areas that are involved in the processing of color, and they don't worry about the interference with the space, whereas monolinguals, they strongly activate the frontal lobes. You will tell me, okay, very interesting, but what is the significance of this? Well, first of all, the significance is that bilinguals are consuming less brain resources. They're like this more principle of economy here, which is important, especially when you age. Because if you can do the task with less resources, well, you have an advantage when aging brings losing resources. So this is interesting. Another thing that we did in the same sense is that we look at the whole brain connectivity. This is very interesting. Not just at looking at the connectivity of the network that is involved in the task, but just look at the whole brain working here. And in fact, what we saw is that while monolinguals were recruiting a vast network, which involved all sorts of areas, visual processing areas, motor areas, executive function areas, and these areas were all interconnected more or less with the same strength. Bilinguals were recruiting a very small network, but highly specialized network in decoding color, which is the key information to solve the task. And this network was just two areas very strongly connected. So now we talk about a principle of efficiency in the bilingual brain, which is, I think, very interesting.
So the bilingual brain is more efficient in a sense?
In this sense, yes. In this sense, yes. And in this particular situation in which you have to focus on relevant information and filter out irrelevant one. And we know that this is something that happens all the time in everyday life. I mean, in a city like New York, where trillions of things are going on at the same time, and you have to focus on where you have to go, and let's say, and don't lose your way, and you have a target in your conversation, and you want to stick to your target, and don't get distracted by all sorts of things going on, or even in the conversation, people can be bringing in all sorts of topics, and you have to stay focused to your, okay, I want to pass this message. Bilinguals are better at that, and they use less brain resources.
Even children, do you think?
This, well, it's a very interesting question. This study has not been done with kids yet, but studies that have been done with kids show that kids are more efficient in filtering out information at the behavioral level. At the brain level, this has not been specifically studied.
Explain a little bit.
Well, for example, if you ask kids to perform a task like the one I just described, bilingual kids make less errors and are faster, significantly faster than monolingual kids, because again they can focus on the information. And I think this is the main reason why bilingual kids are found to be more efficient in other subjects like maths, for example. We know that for mathematics it's very important to stay focused on the instruction of what you have to, let's say, bring as the result of your procedure, and don't get distracted by different avenues that you could take in solving a problem. I mean, problem solving is all about analyzing the situation, finding the solution, and sticking to it. And bilingual kids have been shown, my colleagues working with kids have shown that they are more efficient in this kind of situations.
Before we take a few questions from the audience, what would you recommend? There are a lot of parents in the room and teachers. What would you recommend that they do? Is there a secret recipe that you'd like to
what I would like to do is to demystify some kind of things in regards to the risks of exposing children to languages, even when there are language disabilities or language delay, because this is, I think, very important. First of all, when a child starts learning two languages, it may happen that at the beginning the child speaks comparatively less than a child that is learning one language. This may happen, but this is because the child is figuring out how to class all the items in the mind. It may take some time, but at a certain point, the child knows very well which language is which, and how he has to address him to one person in one language and the other. And this kind of pseudo delay disappears, and the huge advantage of speaking two languages comes up. This is the first myth. There's no problem. If the child takes a little bit more time in, let's say, arriving to the same level of vocabulary, this is worth doing for all the benefits he will have afterwards. Second myth. If you are a bilingual couple, each of the parents has to be identified with one language. This is something that we used to say for a long time, but we don't say this anymore, because this can be, to a certain extent, easier for the child, but if it becomes artificial in everyday communication, it is not good. So just be spontaneous, and the kid will figure it out. Again, it may take some more time, but I mean, it's not dramatic. It's not a dramatic difference. Third myth, and very important, if a child has language delay, you have to eliminate second language learning. This is not true. I have a colleague of mine at University of McGill who has studied this very well. And in fact, kids that have learning disabilities, language learning disabilities, can learn two languages. And this does not bring extra challenge to the child. On the contrary, in some cases, it may be even beneficial because the child has two pots where he can go and pick lexical items or communication, let's say, strategies to face the challenges in communication situations. So I mean, I think that everybody should have the gift of learning a second language. And I think that you are doing a marvelous job in promoting this for all of the reasons that I have explained or tried to explain. And I think that, again, you are probably, as we say in French, sur la crête de la vague. How do you say this in English? You're on the wave, you know, when you surf and you're really on the wave. Because I think that this is what is spontaneously happening in the world today.
Thank you so much. So we're going to take a few questions. I'm not sure how we are doing this. Oh, we have a microphone right here. Perfect.
Thank you so much. My name is Valerie, and this is my husband, Johan. We've been living in New York for about 5 years. I'm a Belgian native, so my mother tongue is Dutch. He's from France, so his mother tongue is French, but our spoken language is actually mostly English. We're expecting a baby, and our biggest question now is what language should we introduce? And it's not so much about the 2 languages, but it's about the 3 languages. So in my mind, ideally, I would talk Dutch to the baby, he would speak French, and then potentially at school or whoever the baby comes in touch with would speak English. But we're wondering if 3 languages is potentially too much. And also to your point about us, communicating not in an artificial but in a natural way to the baby, it might actually make more sense for us to continue to speak English at home too. Alternatively, we could also send the baby to a French school and speak English at home. So it's all these questions about how to find the balance between the 2 and potentially 3 languages.
What is the language that you and your husband speak together?
Mostly English, let's say 80% of the time English, sometimes French, because in Belgium my second language is French, and he's actually currently also studying Dutch.
Wonderful.
Let's be honest.
Wonderful.
That's not really working out.
Wonderful.
So, extra points for effort, but
Absolutely wonderful. I think it's wonderful, and your kid will be gifted with all of these opportunities. I think that your idea of you speaking, at least for the first years, in your mother tongue is something that is. It's a good idea. In fact, there's not much work on trilinguals. It is starting, and it's going to start in a very massive way in the next years because it's more and more frequent. But the few studies about trilinguals show that, in fact, the first years of the child has a tendency to speak the mother tongue. Then the tongue that is the mother tongue for the father is introduced as well. And when the child goes outside and comes to school, it is the language of the environment that takes a lot of place. So again, things will happen spontaneously. It's never too much. It's never too much. The brain is a very powerful organ. I can say powerful. It's the second time I use it today, but it is. So as for being spontaneous in your everyday life, if the language you're using now between the 2 of you is English, it would be, I would advise that you continue in this way, and the kid will figure it out. Again, don't get worried if you see that other children start producing language a little bit faster than your child, because he has to branch the whole stuff in the 2 or 3 languages that he or she will be exposed to. But comprehension should be at the same level in the 3 languages. And also, if you send the child to a daycare, don't make an effort in choosing a daycare that will be specifically devoted to one language. Just let go.
thank you so much.
May I ask? I'm in the same situation as you. Can I say just one thing about it? With a microphone. Okay, hello. So I'm not going to tell you what to do. I just want to share my experience because it's kind of the same. My name is Marcel van Den. I'm a musician. I have one thing in common with you because when I started my PhD, I decided to do it in France and in French. So, and finally, so I grew up in Holland, so I'm Dutch, so my mother tongue is Dutch. Then I left to France to do my PhD study of chemical engineering, but in French. And well, as you can hear, I speak English. So I have 2 daughters, and when my first daughter was born, we were living in France, and I was speaking Dutch to her, my wife was speaking French to her. So when I asked in Dutch, how does a chicken, she says, tok, tok, tok. And when we asked it in French, she said, it does cut, 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 because the animals have,
Yes.
don't say the same thing
Yes.
in different languages.
Absolutely.
So that was fun. So she started to learn Dutch and French, and finally the English, her English teacher finally was called Robbie Williams. She liked him a lot, and by listening to music, she picked up the English in such a way, and it's not a question that I want to share with you because I still don't understand how that is possible. When we heard a song on the radio, my wife and I, we didn't understand what they were singing. Then we asked our daughter to sing the song, and even if she didn't understand what she was singing, we could understand her English singing.
Oh.
So that's maybe something you can think about. So, and now my daughter is studying at McGill in Montreal
Oh my God.
in English. So I'm not a specialist. I just wanted to share this with you, and
Thank you.
I'll leave the microphone to someone else. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to thank you so much for articulating something that has happened in my brain for so long. In my brain, I have 5 languages. I have in different degrees of proficiency. So French and English are stored well, don't get mixed up. But there's also floating parts of Spanish, Russian, and Arabic. And what's interesting is when I'm speaking in English or when I'm speaking in French, I never get mixed up. But when I try and speak Russian, French, or Russian, Spanish, or Arabic, the other languages creep up. I remember once I was in Egypt trying to formulate a sentence in Arabic, and I was learning Arabic for the first time, and all of a sudden Spanish that I hadn't heard in 10 years, or used in 10 years, came back into my brain, and I was making a sentence in Spanish that I didn't even know I could. So how is that explained? How does our brain kind of compartmentalize the languages that we know really well and keep those fragments that kind of resurface at different parts of our lives or different times of our lives?
Very interesting comment, thank you. And it gives me the opportunity to talk about something I didn't have the chance to expose. So, as I said, when you're really proficient in 2 languages, they simply overlap in your brain. There's lots of studies showing that. Some colleagues, I have done some work with some colleagues in Italy in this regard, and it's exactly, the same brain representation for the mother tongue and the second language when you are proficient. When you are less proficient, language is less overlapping the mother tongue, but on top of that, there is the distance between each of the other languages and the mother tongue and second strong language. I try to explain this in a simple way. For example, if you think about Spanish and Italian, these are 2 languages that are close in terms of, let's say, they belong to the same family of languages, they have a phonology, the sounds are similar, the syntax is similar to a certain extent, and so they match better together. So they can, let's say, they can help each other. If you have languages that are much distant, like, let's say, French and Persian, for example, that are very different, then you have different phenomena. It's, for example, there are words that sound similar, that are, let's say, cognates. Those are easy to get. Then you have non-cognates, which are words that mean the same, but are completely different, like, let's say, butterfly and mariposa in Spanish. And then you have other words that sound the same, but mean something completely different. Those are the clangs And those are the most difficult words. For example, I remember my PhD student from Iran. She told me that souris, I think, means something like kidney or something of the sort. So, and you know, you can see the interference with souris in French. Okay, so what happens when you have so many languages that have different distance, interlinguistic distance between them, is that when you are in a, let's say, communicative situation and you have to use a language that is not the most proficient one, what may happen is that a language that is closely related to it, and you will say Spanish and Arabic, and you will see that they are closely related to it to a certain extent, will pop up. Just a question. Is your Arabic, at that time, was your Arabic as strong as your Spanish?
They're both very weak.
First of all, you assimilate languages that are weak one with each other. And in your brain, somehow this is stored in a way that you want to speak one week and the other week pops up. But in this particular case, there's many words in Spanish that have Arabic root. Lots of them. Lots. All the Spanish words that have H's in between and many, many words. So it's not surprising. It's not surprising. And on the other side, Spanish is a much more closer language to French than Arabic. So you have there all the dynamics between your strong language, French, and between the proximity between Spanish and Arabic that were probably playing in your case. It's just a hypothesis.
Thank you.
A few more questions.
Hi, my name's Gina, and I'm a speech language pathologist, except for I didn't get a PhD.
Doesn't matter.
So I think these years many dual-lingual immersion program emerged, and everybody's saying, oh, send your kids to the schools and it will result in better cognitive skills. So I was wondering, as a researcher, do you think, is there research study shows that kids who go to attend those schools will result in better cognitive skills?
There's no specific, in fact it should be done, specific research about bilingual schools, specific research about being bilingual. So being bilingual, if you go to bilingual schools, you become bilingual. So the research has been done with kids that speak two languages. There is no specification in the research as whether they speak two languages because they went to a bilingual school or because they have bilingual parents or the two of them. So the research that is out there is regarding the fact that the kids use two languages. And one important thing is that the best results have been shown in kids that are using language on an everyday basis. So if you go to a bilingual school, you have more chances of using the two languages on an everyday basis. If you go to a unilingual school, well, you can use the two languages at home, but it's not with the same intensity that you are exposed. And on top of that, if you go to bilingual schools and you learn in, let's say, not only in the class, but let's say in art classes or music classes or all sorts of activities in two languages, this is in line with research that shows that the best advantages of bilingualism are found when you use the languages in naturalistic contexts. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
More research needed.
Yes, always, yeah. Because research answers questions but brings new questions, so we never end. The lady.
My name is Andrea and I'm from Venezuela. I'm here. I'm from Venezuela. I've been here for the past 20 years in the United States. And I was wondering about something that you said about gaining gray matter due to the bilingual. What does happen if, for example, I understood that you gain gray matter when you use both of or more than one language.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens if you also have a disability that kind of makes you use a lot your brain? Like, for example, I'm dyslexic and I'm also bilingual. Does that two things are washing off my benefits later on in life?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't think there's any research, to my knowledge, that has been done regarding the potential advantages of bilingualism in the context of dyslexia specifically. But I can tell you about other disabilities. I am interested in aphasia, as I said before, that is to say, the loss of language abilities secondary to stroke or brain damage that can happen with trauma or even in the context of dementia. And what we see is that bilinguals recover better than monolinguals when they have aphasia. Again, because of this reserve they have in executive function. They can select better. However, if the lesion that they get touches the executive control circuit, then we have a problem.
Right, I feel that in my case, the second language, English, helped my dyslexia incredibly.
Could you explain how? I'm interested. Could you explain how?
Well, basically, as far as the reading part, I believe that in Spanish, when you read, is way more phonetic, and you are really connecting words and vowels to make the sounds. Even if you don't know what it means or what you're reading, you can read it in Spanish. In English, through my daughter that is 6 years old and is actually in public school in a bilingual language, I have discovered, I'm also an early child education teacher, that I haven't really worked on it, but through my daughter, have seen how she's learning to read in English, and it's a little bit different because it's not that phonetic language, and it's more global. Like they learn how the word looks, and they know how to sound, and kind of like taking that in my way. Since I'm not reading and I'm not driving stick shift when I'm reading in Spanish, but I'm globally capturing the word and saying, not reading it. Yeah. So that is helping my dyslexia, and when I read out loud, which I tried not to do, I feel that it flows a little bit more because I can just capture some words here and there and kind of like pull a little bit that delay that the dyslexia, I feel, makes me kind of pass one message to one side.
Thank you for that comment, and I'm going to now take the part of the expert in the sense that it is helping you because Spanish being a transparent language, you read by converting the letters into sounds. It's conversion graphème phonème. It's a very transparent language. Whereas English, not being transparent at all, you read by what we call the global manner. And being dyslexic in Spanish, you were handicapped because you were mostly using this decoding of letters and sounds. When you learned English, somehow you developed the global perspective of reading, the global way, and this helps you to overcome the, let's say, the delay you have in decoding each of the sounds of a word. You just grasp the word globally. So that's exactly what you do.
Exactly. I read better in English than I read in Spanish.
Because you're not tapping on your deficit. You're just how do you say it? Circumventing the deficit and applying to the global reading form.
So my gray matter might be increasing too.
I would have to look at your brain.
One more question.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Maybe we have time for one more? Yeah. One more, okay, great.
Oh, yes.
So my question is really about, so I speak, I grew up learning Lebanese, the Lebanese dialect of Arabic, and I'm fluent in it, but I don't read or write Arabic. And I'm wondering if the benefits are the same for somebody that's fluent in the language but can't read or write.
Most of the studies have been focusing on speaking a language, not writing and reading, so you probably have the benefits even if you don't speak and write. but again, you see so many questions to be answered yet, because on top of that, if you compare the writing system in Arabic and let's say other languages, it's so different. And it requires cognitive abilities that are very specific from what I could learn from my students that come from all over the world. And I think it in different, yes.
The written language is
completely different. I remember with Ladan, my student, Persian, she was explaining to me how it worked. And I just said, this looks so difficult to me. It's like it would open a completely new window in my mind and in my brain to learn this. Or, for example, Greek, that is also a different alphabet. So, but the answer to your question is we haven't focused on that, but still focusing exclusively on speaking the languages, the benefits are there.
So, thank you very much, Professor Ansaldo. The French Morning just launched a podcast called Révolution Bilingue. You can hear Professor Ansaldo being interviewed in French this time and on this amazing topic. Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.